Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening for our final presentation of the Young Scientist webinar series of the season. We're going to be hearing from Victoria Moreno, a new updated last name since she got married recently. She's going to be sharing with us about the understanding adaptive capacity and analysis of community perceptions and policy responses to ocean acidification and other marine stressors on the West Coast. And a little bit about the Cape Perpetua Collaborative. My name is Tara DuBois, and I'm the communications coordinator for the collaborative, and it's a pleasure to coordinate the series. And our vision is to foster conservation and collaboration within local communities for scientific exchange, management, awareness, and stewardship from land and sea around the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve. We have three guiding principles: community engagement, leveraging resources, and engaging in partnerships. And as you can see at the bottom, we have a variety of founding partners that include federal and state agencies, some local nonprofits, as well as the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians. The collaborative's focus is around the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve and in Oregon's largest marine reserve. And in addition to the North and South marine protected areas, there's some form of protected waters that stretch from Yachats to Florence. And I always like to give a fun fact, and tonight's is Oregon does not stop at the beach. There's more beneath the surface. And Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is the agency in charge of doing the research within the marine reserves. And they have a fantastic resource library for the program on their website at OregonMarineReserves.com, including resources like this graphic here about when they did their little land camera. It's a camera that drops and stays in one spot down under the water, and here they show how many percentage of those fish that they were seeing on camera, how many they were able to identify. 85% of those drops were usable data. And that bait does not matter. It doesn't make a difference as far as having benefits or not with the camera. But there's many, many other great resources at their resource library. I highly encourage you to check it out if you're interested in learning more. And the collaborative also hosts a variety of community science projects, as you can see here. Some of them are seasonal and some of them are monthly. We have many coming up with the summer season, also adapted due to COVID considerations. So take a look at our calendar and you'll see some of those upcoming trainings. I believe there's the Pelican Count training coming up in the end of April. And we also host a Cape Perpetua Winter Speaker Series that goes November through March. And we just wrapped that a couple weeks ago. But you can find out all of these events and speakers on our calendar. Once we confirm, we post them, and so you can always see what's happening. And I always like to encourage you to connect with us on our Facebook page as well as our YouTube channel. And with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight, Victoria Moreno. She is pursuing her Master of Public Policy from Oregon State University and working with Dr. Anna Spalding to analyze adaptive capacity along the West Coast. Her graduate research aims to understand the Dungeness crabbers' perception of their ability to adapt to ocean acidification and other environmental stressors. Through interviews and policy analysis, Victoria hopes to provide an assessment of the Oregon Dungeness crab industry ability to adapt to ocean acidification and other environmental stressors. She graduated in 2019 from the University of Richmond with her Bachelor of Science in Environmental Studies and Anthropology, where she explored the intersectionality of environmental change in marine ecosystems and corresponding human effects within the coastal communities. When she's not working on her research, she enjoys cooking, reading, engaging with the community, and exploring the Pacific Northwest with her Great Pyrenees puppy. How sweet. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Victoria. You can pull up your PowerPoint. And I just want to let everybody know as she's pulling that up that we'll do questions at the end and also a brief way midpoint. So if you have questions as they come up, feel free to add them to the chat or the Q&A section, and we will get to those during the Q&A sections. And with that, Victoria, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you for the introduction. And again, everyone, my name is Victoria Marino, and I am a second year Master of Public Policy student at Oregon State University in the School of Public Policy. I'm also a NOAA Living Marine Resource Cooperative Science Center Fellow, and they have aided in this research as well. And today I'll be presenting to you all on understanding adaptive capacity, an analysis of community perceptions and policy responses to ocean acidification and other marine stressors on the West Coast. And before I get into just the project and all, I just want to give you an overview of the presentation and what it will cover. First, we'll go over the question that I'm asking for my research, then into some background just so the concepts and the foundations are understood. I'll go into the goals of my projects, how I did it or what I did, and then I'll share with everyone some results and then end on the conclusions. And so for my research question, I am asking, how do members of Oregon's Dungeness crab industry perceive their adaptive capacity to ocean acidification and other environmental stressors? And I came to this question as my advisor, Dr. Anna Spalding, is doing research on regional vulnerability to ocean acidification along the West Coast, along with other scientists from various institutions. And these projects include just looking at how the shellfish industry adapts to ocean acidification in an interdisciplinary fashion. Now, my work will feed into these larger projects of regional vulnerability to ocean acidification. And that's just the background of how I got to this question and an interesting point that it's one piece to a larger narrative. Now, in this question, there are two big concepts that we will cover just within the background to give foundation for the project. And those two concepts are adaptive capacity and ocean acidification. So first we will review what is ocean acidification. Now, before getting into the ins and outs of ocean acidification, it's important to recognize that oceans cover about 70% of the Earth's surfaces, which is a great amount. And they take up large proportions of carbon dioxide or CO2 that's in the atmosphere. Specifically, the oceans can absorb about 1/4 to 1/3 of CO2 that humans create, which is a large proportion in comparing to other ecosystems and systems in general. And with these higher levels of CO2 intake and then increased CO2 production by humans, whether it's through industry or the day-to-day things we do, the oceans take that in and it disrupts the ocean chemistry. As you could see in the bottom left-hand side of the diagram, the ocean chemistry changes when CO2 goes up and it makes the oceans more acidic. This process is ocean acidification, and it has many impacts. One, on the organisms that live in the ocean, and then the people who depend on these. So going into how ocean acidification impacts marine organisms, specifically it impacts shell-forming organisms like the ones you see on the screen, mussels, oysters, urchins, and corals. And these organisms are unique in which they need to build shells and skeletons just to survive. And with the change in ocean chemistry, it does not allow these organisms to make strong shells for long-term development. And when their development is affected, not only does it affect the creatures itself, but it also has an impact on the people who rely on them. So an example of this relationship between organism harm and humans is a significant oyster crash in 2007 here in Oregon at the Whiskey Creek hatchery, where the larval oysters or oysters in early development were impacted by ocean acidification. Not only did it harm the oysters themselves as they were unable to develop any further, but it hurt the business and those who relied on the income from the products. Okay, moving on. And so for my research, I will be focusing on Dungeness crabs and ocean acidification and that relationship. The diagram on the screen speaks to the process that we just described as oceans absorb a fair amount of CO2, and that changes the ocean chemistry. And the ocean chemistry can impact Dungeness crabs. Dungeness crabs are also shell-forming organisms, and they require certain chemistries to fully develop. Now, research on Dungeness crabs and ocean acidification suggests that ocean acidification may impact Dungeness crabs at larval stages. However, there should be more research done in controlled and uncontrolled settings to really understand that relationship. And for my research, aside from the chemistry and the biology, I'll just be focusing on how people are affected. As the diagram shows, if Dungeness crabs are impacted, it can impact the industry, the economy, and just those communities that rely on the product. And I'm interested to see that relationship and what people think about ocean acidification and Dungeness crabs. And specifically, I'll be focusing on the perspectives of the Oregon Dungeness crab industry. And just to give some background into the industry, it holds high economic and cultural importance to communities along the Oregon coast and the state. And just to give some specific facts, the Oregon Dungeness crab industry produces about 16 million pounds of Dungeness crab a year. There are about 424 boats in the Oregon Dungeness crab fleet, and crab fishermen in the state combined make up to 33 million all the way to 74 million a year. And these facts just show the value of the industry in terms of economic or social realms. And I'm looking at ocean acidification's impact and effect on these communities and people who are reliant to the Dungeness crab industry at large. So now we went over ocean acidification, and the other concept that's foundational for the research is adaptive capacity. Now, adaptive capacity refers to the conditions that enable people to anticipate and respond to change, to minimize the consequences, to recover, and to take advantage of new opportunities. Or in other terms, adaptive capacity can refer to how well systems can adapt to a stressor. So why is adaptive capacity important? I can tell you its importance for this research in 3 reasons. 1, adaptive capacity is important in the industrial terms, and by understanding adaptive capacity, we can understand how to support the industry and those who are reliant on it. In academic purposes and importance, adaptive capacity is a complex concept and very fascinating theory to dive into. And in the policy realm, adaptive capacity is important because it allows for an understanding of how policy could be used as a tool for intervention. Now, we're going to go more into the 3 importances just now. So going back to industry importance, as I mentioned before, the Dungeness crab industry is highly valuable to the state of Oregon and the communities along the coast in that economic and cultural way. And so given the importance of the industry and the facts that are relisted on the screen, understanding the adaptive capacity will allow for us to strategize and plan for long-term sustainability of the industry. And these tools will not just be important for addressing ocean acidification, but any other environmental, social, political, or economic stressors that the industry and communities may face, and other industries alike, as the tools and strategies can be used for other fisheries. Now going into the importance in the academic realm. Adaptive capacity is a very challenging concept to study. Overall, there's a lack of cross-cutting research assessing adaptive capacity in institutions and communities regarding ocean acidification. And in the social and natural scientists realm, adaptive capacity is not a very cohesive or unified concept. In a study done by A.R. Siders in 2019, looking at 270 papers on adaptive capacity, it was found that there were 64 indicator frameworks, that there were 37 measures for methods, that there were 158 determinants of adaptive capacity, but all were similarly defined. So they weren't combined into other determinants, but all separate. And the average paper was cited or only cited 3 other papers on adaptive capacity. And so these facts just show how a complex concept is highly fragmented. And that fragmented nature of adaptive capacity can cause for a failure to implement effective policy and community initiatives in addressing ocean acidification or other environmental stressors, since it's not a cohesive way of thinking. And to overcome this fragmented nature of the concept of adaptive capacity, I chose to use a framework that was developed by Sinner et al. In 2018, and which you see on your screen. And according to this framework, adaptive capacity is seen in these 5 domains: assets, flexibility, organization, learning, and agency. And I will go more into these domains later into the project, but one important thing to see and remember when looking at the framework visually is that all the domains are dependent on one another. It's not just assets or learning, they are all interconnected when considering and thinking about adaptive capacity as a whole. And now jumping to the importance of policy and adaptive capacity. By understanding adaptive capacity, we can understand how policy could be used as a tool for intervention. Now, don't look too much into the figures on the screen. They're just examples of policy processes, and they're not the exact processes I'm using for this research project. However, it's important to take in the major aspects and relationships going on in these processes, specifically between systems, networks, and stakeholders. And once the relationship between systems, networks, and stakeholders is understood, it will allow for an understanding of how policy can enact change or be that intervention tool to help adapting. And this process of understanding the systems, networks, and stakeholders will be applied in some way to my project, so I can identify how and if policy can be used as a tool of intervention or change for the Oregon Dungeness crab industry and their adaptive capacity. And so I just want to stop here and take a moment for questions just before I get into the ins and outs of my projects, since we went over some big theoretical concepts and all.
So if you have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat or the Q&A. And while we wait for one to potentially roll in, I just want to say how much I'm appreciating how you're sharing that the components are very much interconnected. Not even just with your part of the research is connected to such a bigger project, but how each component of adaptive capacity relies on the other, because that is so true. Got a question in just a second. Okay. Do you think adaptive capacity is a better goal or process than working toward resiliency? Example, returning to some norm or baseline.
I think that they can go hand in hand. So when you look at vulnerability as a whole, resilience and adaptive capacity and sensitivity and exposure are all similarly defined. And this adds to the complexity and adaptive capacity as a theory, and how better definitions can streamline maybe the adaptive capacity process and resilience process, because in hand at times the studies are very similar or asking similar questions. And so I don't think one is better than the other. I think they can almost be replace one another at times, whether you're saying adaptation or resiliency. And it is also highly dependent on the field that you're looking at. So whether it is humans versus organisms, adaptation and then resiliency can also be interchanged. I'm not sure if that fully answered the question, because again, it is a complex way of like, how exactly does one define resilience, and what indicators make a system or person or organism more resilient, and what indicators make a system, person, or organism more like able to adapt. Because if the indicators can be interchanged, then the question is almost the same. And so, yeah, I think you would have to dive more into the definitions there and see if the questioning process is similar or different truly.
Very cool.
Yeah,
And that looks like all the questions for now.
awesome. Well, I will get into the project itself. So, giving some insight on the project goals. First, I just want to use and understand the framework that I shared with y'all before by Center et al. In 2018 and just their adaptive capacity framework. The second goal of the project is to learn what members of Oregon's Dungeness crab industry perceive or how they perceive their adaptive capacity to ocean acidification and other environmental stressors. And last, I just want to show why this work is important, specifically by offering policy recommendations to stakeholders and institutions. So, what did I do, or how do I do it? And so, for the completion of this project, I conducted interviews with members of Oregon's Dungeness crab industry, and I completed a policy and content analysis. And now I'll go into the details about what I did for each aspect of the project in the upcoming slides. And first, going into the methods of the interviews. So I've currently interviewed 13 members of Oregon's Dungeness crab industry. Of course, all virtual as my research fell within the year of COVID. And as of now, it's a pretty evenly distributed interview pool throughout Oregon's coast. If you break it into north, central, and south, roughly about 1/3 of each region was accounted for in the interviews. And interviews were conducted by snowball sampling, which is where I just started with a select group of participants and then got other participants after that. And the interview guide, or just the questions, were informed by prior research that has been conducted along the West Coast. As I mentioned before, my work is one smaller piece into a larger narrative, and my questions are similar to the ones my advisor and her team is working with. And so for the analysis portion of the interviews, that just entails transcribing them or writing all the interviews out and then reviewing the written interviews for any themes and all. And we'll get more into the themes and findings in a little bit. But first, going on to the policy and content analysis portion of the project. So for this portion, I reviewed hard and soft policies. Now, hard policies, definitely a different term, but they could be considered law, legislation, and pieces with legal standing. So a few of the documents reviewed under the hard policy category include Oregon's Senate Bill, the 1039, the Clean Water Act, which is on a federal level, and then state and regional Dungeness crab industry rules and regulations. Now, soft policies, unlike hard policies, can be considered reports, initiatives, and plans that do not have legal standing, but they do have an impact on the state or local perspectives and activities that are happening. And so some of the soft policies I've looked at was Oregon's Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Action Plan, initiatives and plans from the ODQ, other reports from NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program or the Interagency Working Group on Ocean Acidification, and some plans from the International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification. And after reviewing all those documents, and just reading them, taking them in, understanding the layout, they were reviewed for the following themes: adaptive capacity and its domains, which you see on the screen, the assets, learning, flexibility, agency, and social organization. Other themes that came up throughout the review process were environmental stressors, particularly outside of ocean acidification, external motivations or limitations for adaptation specifically, and then any areas where I found recommendation for policy that can be incorporated. And so throughout this analysis, I will compare the soft and hard policies with one another, but then also the interview results to tell that larger story of the industry's adaptive capacity to ocean acidification and the related threats. And to give you all a better visual of how that analysis process will go. First, again, it's the understanding of ocean acidification policies and the Oregon Dungeness crab management. And so for the ocean acidification policy side, again, it's just developing that understanding of the soft and hard policies. On the Dungeness crab management side, it's grabbing understanding of the overall structure of the industry, how it operates, also identifying if there are any rules that relate to adapting to ocean acidification or any environmental stressors. And then last, just seeing if there were examples where the industry had to adapt to environmental stressors or other social stressors. And through that process, then I'll compare it to the Dungeness crab fisherman perspectives. And in that comparison, I will ask questions such as, do the ocean acidification policies or the Dungeness crab management rules and regulations match or reflect the perspectives of Dungeness crab fishermen? In that, I'll also ask, where are areas to improve, or where do the policies or management meet the perspectives? Now, one important thing to note is while these arrows and this figure shows a direct relationship, that may not always be the case, especially looking at ocean acidification policy or Dungeness crab management. They're two separate entities and they may not overlap because they have different goals that they're achieving. And this is like the fascinating part about the policy piece. It's asking, should there be more ocean acidification policy or should there be more management? Well, or is there a one policy fits all? And we'll go more into those questions when I jump into the results. So starting off with preliminary interview results, and just full disclosure, the research isn't fully complete yet, but I will just share the general findings and themes that have been accumulated thus far. And so overall, ocean acidification is not seen as an immediate threat among crab fishermen, particularly those I've interviewed. Another general finding is that Oregon's Dungeness crab industry has always been flexible in its response to changing ocean conditions. As many of y'all know, the ocean is a dynamic entity. It's always changing daily, monthly, yearly, and the Oregon Dungeness crab industry has just proven its robustness and long-term sustainability as they've been able to overcome the changing conditions that they've faced. And then in general, I found there's been a differences in responses between those I've interviewed who have or operate on large vessels versus small vessels, along with those who may work closely with the scientific community or the management community and those who do not. And so, as I told you before, we're going to jump back to the domain definitions of adaptive capacity just before I go into the individual themes I found throughout the research. And so, again, it's the assets, flexibility, social organization, learning, and agency. Assets refer to the resources stakeholders have access to. Flexibility is the ability to switch between adaptation strategies. Social organization refers to how stakeholders are organized, able to cooperate, make joint decisions, and share knowledge. Learning, the capacity to generate and obtain information, in this case, specifically regarding ocean acidification and other related stressors. And agency, the power and freedom to shape their future. And so in reviewing the interviews, I looked at these domains and as themes and pulled out where they matched or were matched throughout the interview and the perspectives that were given. And so going into more of the thematic results from the interviews, starting off with assets, resources they have access to, interviewees mentioned boats, gear, for example, the number of pots, crew members, and other means of income, which all can be considered assets to the members I've spoken to in the Dungeness crab industry. Going on to flexibility and the disability to switch between adaptation strategies. A few of the interviewees mentioned they had other jobs outside of commercial fishing, which is an important way to switch from strategies if need be. Most of the interviewees also noted that they participated in other fisheries outside of the Dungeness crab fishery, which is again another flexible means of adaptation. And last, some of the interviewees mentioned that they had permits outside of Oregon, just for other fisheries or during various other seasons, which again increases flexibility. In terms of social organization or just how members are organized, make decisions, and cooperate with one another, they can make decisions in many organizations that they are part of. So, at least a third of the interviewees sit on advisory boards or participate with organizations such as the ODFW, Oregon Dungeness Crab Commission, and other local organizations. Also, a third of the interviewees have worked with scientists at institutions such as NOAA, Oregon State University, and the ODFW, which just shows organization and the ability to have a voice and make decisions with scientists and management. And that's highly important in terms of social organization. Another interesting and important aspect of the social organization that I've learned throughout the interviews is that many interviewees noted that knowledge is shared throughout the industry locally and with members within their community or region. And that is a large aspect of how knowledge is shared, how they work together and cooperate just to make sure the industry is sustainable long term and that they work together to get through a season. Continuing on with some of the preliminary interview results, learning another adaptive capacity trait, and just going over the ability to generate and obtain information. A few of the interviewees mentioned that they would read scientific papers to stay informed. And as mentioned before, a third have worked with scientists or management, and they've noted that's how they stay informed with just environmental stressors or other issues that are occurring. A interesting quote that I wanted to share that showed kind of the flip side of learning is that it was noted scientific information is a bit harder to come across because of the processes and technicalities involved in the studies. Unless the people from the scientific community engages with them, it's hard to gather that information. And I know most of the results I've shared this way almost show like a plus of the adaptive capacity domain. But throughout this process, there are minuses, whether it's coming from learning, agency, social organization, flexibility, and all. And so, moving out of the realm of adaptive capacity, there were other themes that I've been pulling out of the interview, such as environmental challenges or changes outside of ocean acidification. And for most of the interviews I've gathered, challenges or changes can include HABs or harmful algal blooms, domic acid, just temperature changing, different species or organisms coming and going from locations that they will fish in, and whale entanglement all are challenges and changes that the industry has faced over the years. Last, going into some external motivations and limitations to adapting. Limitations can include COVID, that's been just a major changer in the past 2 years. The market changes, whether they come from COVID or just general market changes, impact the industry. A limitation for adapting can be a lack of speed in addressing various issues that the industry may face or find pertinent. And a motivation for adapting that I found throughout the interviews has been community value and industry value, just wanting to maintain that long term sustainability. And that community value pushes for members to adapt to things just because it is a community importance. And so, wrapping up the preliminary interview results, again, as I stated before, these are just part of the findings as I'm preparing for graduation and finishing up the work. Am finishing up the analysis, which not only involves picking out more examples of these themes, but connecting the themes. As I showed way back when in the beginning of the presentation, adaptive capacity is not just made up of assets or learning, it's how all of the domains are connected with one another. That dependency also means that there could be a strength in social organization and not a great strength in learning or any combination of the sorts. But it will still allow an industry or system to have the ability to adapt to stressors because, again, it's a connected system, and that will be what I'll be toiling out through this analysis process. Now, jumping towards the preliminary policy analysis results. And for now, I'll just share the general understanding of the themes that I found throughout the ocean acidification policy and Dungeness crab management, as the meat of this analysis will come into comparing it to the Dungeness crab fishermen perspectives and asking those questions. Does policy reflect the perspectives, or management reflect the perspectives, and how or where can improvements be made, or does improvements need to be made? So focusing first on the ocean acidification level at the local, state, regional, or federal levels in ocean acidification policy, hard and soft policies, many legislation and plans have the following topics: research, monitoring, education and awareness, building resilience, and adaptation to ocean acidification. The documents on the slide are just examples of policy at a federal level and then just a plan for the state level. And in both, you can see that these themes are found there: the call for more research and monitoring, the call for educating communities or understanding how adaptive or resilient they are to ocean acidification and what tools may be needed. And it just shows how at multiple dimensions that ocean acidification policies, themes, and focuses align. Now I'm jumping over to the Dungeness crab policy analysis results, and just basically the structure is one of the questions that was asked and needed to be understand for this research process. And the structure of the Oregon Dungeness crab industry revolves around the three S's: size, sex, and season. And that's basically how the industry operates. And it shows when they can commercially crab, what can be crabbed, and just that process. In terms of other rules and regulations, they tend to focus on daily management and operations. And so I won't give all those specifications. But an interesting thing when just looking at the industry, there are many organizational examples of how management has responded, and like management and members have responded to challenges such as domic acid or whale entanglement, which can elude and inform how ocean acidification could be approached if it became an immediate threat. And so in this policy analysis and process, where do the interventions come in? Overall, the research process will show how and if policy can be used as a tool for intervention, as we spoke about before, specifically for the industry and just the coastal communities and their adaptive capacity. The interviews itself will and the policy will show where their strengths and weaknesses to adapting to ocean acidification based on the domains. And hopefully throughout these interview processes, the needs of the communities will be better understood. And then through that understanding, it will show where policy could assist in addressing any needs. However, it is important to remember there's no one policy fits all, or that's something I've become to recognize throughout this process. I'm unsure, and based off of this process thus far, if ocean acidification will be the one policy fits all, or if management could fix and fully build adaptive capacity. It might have to come in forms of focusing on health, education, and other economic policies instead of specifically focusing on ocean acidification and management. And hopefully throughout the end of this process, I will have those exact policy recommendations and an answer to which avenue the policy interventions can come through. And so just giving everyone the general next steps for the projects. Again, finishing up the analysis to determine the industry's adaptive capacity, and in that making those relations and connections between the interviews and ocean acidification and management policies and how they may impact the industry's adaptive capacity. After the analysis is complete, I will make those recommendations on just how to support adaptive capacity along the Oregon coast. And it's very important just throughout the program and this process to think about where the policy recommendations can go. So they're just not sitting in like a shelf in the library after the thesis is completed. And thinking through that, I believe the policy recommendations could inform initiatives at agencies such as the Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Council here in Oregon. They could expand to some of the federal efforts, for instance, with the Interagency Working Group on Ocean Acidification. And again, I'm working with a bigger team. And while this is one smaller piece of the narrative, there will be many opportunities to share this information. And so, just wrapping it up and hitting the conclusions of the presentation, overall, understanding adaptive capacity of the Dungeness crab industry can provide insights of where policy can intervene and just insights at local, state, and federal levels. Again, this is one piece of a larger story of how ocean acidification impacts the West Coast, and it just taking a lens into how it may impact industries throughout Oregon. And so it'll be really fascinating when this research is done, along with the work that my advisor and collaborators are doing to have that larger narrative of ocean acidification vulnerability on the West Coast. And before I fully finish, I just wanted to say thank you first and foremost to those who participated in the interviews. Their time and stories have just been so valuable throughout this process, and I just appreciated the time they took, especially during a pandemic, to speak to me. I also wanted to thank my advisor, Dr. Anna Spalding, along with my committee members who've helped me thus far along my research process. Of course, Oregon State University School for Public Policy, so as I'm getting my master's there, and then NOAA's LMR CSC program, where they're just funding my research as well. And so thank you all for getting me to this point. And that is it for my presentation. I am more than happy to take any other questions that everyone may have.
Fascinating research. I have a couple of questions. You had mentioned your research isn't complete yet. Does that include potentially interviewing more fishermen?
Yes. So in social science, there's this term called saturation, which can get a little complicated at times. But basically, when you are reviewing your interviews and just doing interviews and all, you do some, you write them out, analyze it. And in that process, if you see generally the same themes or answers that your pool have given you, you're fully saturated, because you know that if you ask
Mm.
more questions or complete more interviews, that you probably will get the same results. However, if you just have a wide array of answers and responses, and almost every interview is different, you're probably unsaturated in the sense that if you were to speak with more members, whether in my case of the industry or just get more interviews, that you don't have that full consensus or narrative
Mhm.
that will be the determinant of whether I conduct more interviews. I am not sure if I'm fully hitting saturation or not. It seems like I may, but I want to go through it a little bit more to make sure I have it all, or determine if I do not have it all yet. So
Yeah.
it's something I'm thinking through.
And at the end of your research, as you kind of develop out those adaptive, like what's the best type of adaptive policy and whatnot, does that go a step further then? Do you guys present that to like the state or anything for it to potentially become a law or a policy?
Well, so they will definitely be presented to various agencies and entities that we've been working with. I know just myself, I've had an engagement with NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program, and the team at large has engagement with various state agencies. Whether they become full policy or those hard policies or soft policies is
Right.
kind of unseen yet. It depends on the opportunities at like the state and federal levels as well, and also what is exactly needed. Is it more education or research or monitoring, and will the recommendations be more so of a call for those initiatives rather than a direct policy that whether we should make like changes with the ocean
Mhm.
or things of that nature. So it's hard to tell, but hopefully it can inform, if anything, initiatives and plans at various levels.
Yeah. And where were the policies you reviewed from Oregon only, or did your analysis include other West Coast states and Canada?
So for the most part, they included Oregon policies. It did expand to federal policies in terms of what may impact Oregon. So, for instance, the Clean Water Act, it's a federal policy and it impacts the states at different levels. There, as a part of the bigger project, there is like a separate policy analysis for California and looking into tribal policies. And so there's also on the Dungeness side, crab side of things, that regional policy management as well. So in terms of that, I've focused more on the relationship between Oregon, Washington, and California, haven't extended past that in looking at how management and rules may impact the Dungeness crab industry. So it can the issue with policy and research in general is like choosing a point to stop because it could definitely become very large in thinking about, well, do I look at every policy that says ocean acidification? Well, there's not too many that say ocean acidification, but if you expand that to water quality, then that just opens a whole nother can of worms. And it's like,
Right.
okay, what qualifies as important when considering ocean acidification when you think of water policy, or where do you stop? And I think I found that line of just focusing more on the state and federal policies in Oregon in terms of ocean acidification, and then looking at the state and regional policies when it comes to Dungeness crab management as the larger narrative and like the larger project is considering regional policies when it comes to ocean acidification as well. So I'll let the group add all of that together.
It's always amazing how complex it can get. And you mentioned that ocean acidification wasn't an immediate concern for crabbers. Did they have general awareness and understanding of ocean acidification? And also, what would you say is the crabbers' number one stress or concern?
Yes. Well, overall, there was that general understanding and awareness of ocean acidification. Um, yeah, in terms of just the ocean acidification's impact on the Dungeness crabs, as I mentioned before, it may impact the larval stages, but of course, there's definitely more research that needs to be done before making the hard claims of it will or has this effect. And there's also life stage considerations that need to happen in terms of that as well. But ocean acidification seems to have that general awareness throughout those I've spoken to in the interviews. It's just not that immediate threat, like I mentioned. And then answering the second part of the question, that's hard. I think, I mean, one thing that has been brought up in almost every interview, and it's hard not to bring up, is COVID and just how that
Right.
has so many impacts, whether it's just on operations, on the market. It has impacted trade nationally, but and internationally. And then thinking down to levels of like, are people going out to restaurants and getting like crabs? Do they like want live crabs, or all those safety concerns that may not
Mhm.
directly link to the Dungeness crab industry when someone's thinking about COVID, but it does have that impact. And I think it's safe to say it's one of the biggest impacts currently.
Yeah. And we've all kind of had to do some of our own adapting in our capacities because of COVID. And this person says, great presentation. I am curious if you know how many of your interviewees are not first generation fisher people, or whether their adaptation strategies are related to whether they have familiar ties, values in the industry, more so than just as a financial means.
Hmm. I think that's a very fascinating question and something I am hoping to toil out more. I From like what I can say from my general findings, most are not first generation fishers or fishermen. If anything, it's like been a family business, or they are learning from parents or grandparents who've done this. And so it's not, I think in the beginning I mentioned it's economically important, but also has that cultural significance as well as the knowledge is local. It's familial in some senses and it's like passed down. So I have gotten the mention that it's like hard to just wake up one day and say I want to become a crab fisherman because it does take a lot of knowledge and almost like living in it to understand the processes and just how to do the work.
Yeah, and that wraps our questions for the evening. Just one last comment in the chat that great presentation. Thank you for sharing and look forward to hearing and reading more. And I want to second that. Thank you so much for joining us and helping us wrap up this series, Victoria. And I am really looking forward to seeing the end of your research. This is a really fascinating and complex topic, and but needed and necessary and so important. So appreciate you doing that and sharing the research with us.
Yeah, thank you. And thank everyone for like watching and thank you just for giving me the ability and the time to just go over my research and the findings I've had this far.
Absolutely. The thanks are rolling in. Great work. Have a good evening.
I think
Bye-bye, everybody.